Although the Civil War started out as more of a fight for independence, the Emancipation Proclamation clearly shifted the focus to slavery. Once the war was won, the question of how to put everything back together became key. Lincoln wanted swift reconstruction with limited punishment for the South. He hoped that they would independently work to integrate newly freed blacks into society. The only thing he required was an oath of allegiance from the South, and then they were basically back in. His assassination brought a quick end to any hopes of swift reconstruction. Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor, seemed to be even more lenient towards the South. His only demand was that they ratify the 13th Amendment, and this was not because he had a desire to establish equality. While slavery was in effect, the 3/5 clause allowed the South to count each slave as 3/5 of a person towards their population. If slavery was abolished, then they would count as a whole person. This would increase the number of representatives in the House for the South and expand the power of the Democratic Party. Johnson, being a Democrat, was all for it. In reality, this amendment would actually let the South undermine the Republican goals to gain rights for newly emancipated blacks. The radical Republicans were not fooled and quickly pushed for Johnson's impeachment. They set up a new plan which included military occupation of the South to make sure they did what they were supposed to do. Their plan made states recognize black civil rights before they could be readmitted. They also passed the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, which guaranteed due process and voting rights. The 15th Amendment would allow blacks to not only vote, hopefully for Republicans, but also allowed them to run for office and send representatives to Congress. The South did not respond favorably to these institutions. They felt disenfranchised. The core of their lifestyle depended on slavery, and they felt their power being taken away from them. The military occupation added to these concerns. The Confederacy was formed originally because they didn't want to be controlled by Northern Republicans. Now, as a result of these feelings, the South resorted to violence as a means to discourage both Republicans and blacks from implementing the steps towards equality. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan killed and tortured hundreds of people in attempts to discourage blacks from voting and to scare Southern Republicans. They targeted blacks, white sympathizers, and teachers from the North. Violence was not the only way the South suppressed blacks. The use of Jim Crow laws to enforce racial segregation were very popular. The goal was to legally prevent blacks from voting and participating in elections. The South feared that black votes would go only to Republicans, and that the Democrats would lose their power. Poll taxes, literacy tests, and residency requirements specifically targeted newly freed blacks. The Grandfather Clause exempt poor whites from many of these requirements. Here is where we see how Reconstruction played a major role in the continuation of racism. Because the South felt that they were being treated unfairly, they doubled down on their opposition to change. A fear of lack of representation forced them to lash out both violently and politically. And this could be understandable. From their point of view, their rights were being taken away from them, so they had to fight back. The problem is that their quote-unquote rights involved suppressing the rights of others. Sharecropping allowed Southern whites to continue to economically benefit off the labor of black Americans. The system allowed a landowner to rent out their land to people in exchange for a large percentage of the crop. This system encouraged the tenants to produce as much as possible to pay back the debts they owed. The landowners would give the farmers food, equipment, and the means to plant the crops. They expected to be paid back when the crop was harvested. The majority of these farms became severely indebted to the owners because of high interest rates and the unpredictability of the crops. The debt bound them to the land. If they tried to leave, they would be arrested and sent to a prison labor camp, which was far worse than their current situation. Although it wasn't slavery in name, the system effectively bound black Americans to white landowners many years after the 13th Amendment was ratified. the white landowners were able to continue controlling blacks by economically crippling them. Racism was winning in the South. Black voices were being suppressed, and white men held the majority of the power yet again. Any pushback from the African American community seemed only to lead to more backlash. In 1866, a small argument between a few black and white men turned into a full-fledged riot in Memphis. White men, aided by the police, proceeded to burn down several churches and schools in the black neighborhood. Events like these were commonplace in the South, and they helped continue the resurgence of white supremacy. The movement was made all the more powerful by the addition of poor whites. It was transitioning from that of the wealthy and powerful to white men of all backgrounds. The Klan's ranks were filled with the poor and rich alike. This alliance can be seen as a direct result of the occupation of the South and the radical changes that the Republicans made. Many poor whites were no better off than newly freed slaves, but because a threat was presented to what little they had, they saw a need to fight back. This violent racism would not have survived without the assistance of the poor white demographic. So in many ways, Reconstruction is to blame. Congress tried to respond to the Southern resistance. They passed 3 enforcement acts in an attempt to stop this terrorism and preserve the rights of black Americans. These acts gave the federal government the power to act in places where state governments failed. This especially applied to situations where state governments were turning a blind eye to these radical groups. With the help of the military, the KKK seemingly faded away. It seemed as though the U.S. government was successful in protecting black Americans and reuniting the nation. What they failed to understand, however, was that the damage was already done. The Klan had effectively weakened the Republican Party in the South and struck fear into the hearts of black voters. Although the terrorists had been suppressed, everyone knew that the threat was still there. More work would need to happen before this problem was truly solved. With the Republican powers waning in the South, the focus of the party turned elsewhere. Westward expansion, the Indian Wars, and industrial growth were seen as more pressing issues. The general view in the North was that they had done all they could do in the South, and now they needed to move on. The radical Republicans were supplanted by planter elites known as the Redeemers. They pushed for reduced rights of blacks and poor whites. This served to increase the division of classes. Grant's election gave hope to Southern Republicans and blacks, but his presidency was crippled by numerous scandals and economic crises. This led to a split of the Republican Party, with the new faction opposing Grant's plan for Reconstruction. As a result, Democrats gained seats in the House and the balance of power began to shift. The Reconstruction era officially ended with a closed-door agreement between Democrats and Republicans. The agreement was that Rutherford B. Hayes would be supported for the presidency in exchange for the last federal troops being removed from the South. This period allowed the Southern planter class to continue persecution of black Americans. Although the radical Republicans did advocate for equal rights, their occupation of the South seemingly strengthened the white supremacy movement. The occupation caused poor and rich Southern whites to band together and attack the opposition. These radical movements would not have survived without the aforementioned union. Coupling the repercussions of occupation with the lack of commitment to civil rights shows how the Reconstruction era failed black Americans. At its end, the white planter class was still able to take advantage of black Americans through sharecropping. They also successfully suppressed the black vote and their powers as citizens. Reconstruction ensured that although black people were no longer property, they certainly weren't equal either.